you want to start this thing off?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This is the Planning and Zoning meeting on January 19th at 6:30, I think 2 p.m. Roll call, Lisa Shaw Allen here. Commission member Robert Deviney. Commission member Sonia Villalobos.
Here.
Welcome back. Commission member, yes ma'am. Commission member Jen Duncan.
Here.
Commission member Mike McLeod.
Here.
And Commission member Sam Clinton.
Here.
Great. If we can all stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which is one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So public comments. Any citizen who desires to address the Planning and Zoning Commission on matters not included on the agenda may do so during public comments section of the agenda. The Planning and Zoning Commission may not deliberate on comments presented under this agenda item. Due to the nature of this online meeting, citizens who wish to make public comment may submit comment in writing via email to the city secretary or in the drop box located outside of City Hall at 409 Main Street in Martindale, Texas, no later than noon, Tuesday, January 19th, 2021. Comments should be limited to 500 words or less, approximately half a page, or to meet the normal 3-minute time limit per comment. The first 10 comments submitted will be read at the meeting. Sylvia, did we have any comments submitted?
None.
Do we have anyone in-house who would like to make a comment about something that is not on the agenda?
Nobody's raising their hand.
Oh, okay, then we can move forward. I just want to make certain I'm looking on here. Do we have, Jared, if you can unmute Mr. Steve Ramsey?
All right. Steve, you should get an alert that says to unmute.
Okay.
There you go. You have a live mic.
Mr. Ramsey, are you? Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome. Mr. Ramsey is our city engineer who has done some work on this particular project. So I'm going to read the agenda item, and then I would like to give a little backstory and preface before we open it up. So number 5A, discussion and possible action on rezoning West Ridge Estates Lot 6, which is 5.01 acres, to commercial. So what I would like to explain to the commission is where this came from. There is the property owner is interested in doing a project on her property. We had a meeting, I believe, back in December, early December, maybe late November, with this property owner, that she speaks very little English, first of all. And so Sylvia will have to translate for her. Is Lilia in the chambers?
No.
Okay, I spoke with her earlier, so she may be coming in. So if somebody will let me know if she does. So she's interested in doing
we have some dial-ins. We have some people calling in. Did she indicate that she was going to call in?
She might be doing that. I do not. Well, you know what? I do know her phone number, so maybe we can identify it.
Ending in 2180?
No, sir. It's ending in 0856.
Okay. Nope.
Okay. So carrying on, she's interested in doing a project on her property, And based on the nature of her limited English, we had some, it took a while to kind of understand what she was looking to do. All in all, she is wanting to use the majority of the property for an RV park that would have approximately 20 sites. She also would like to have a portion, like an acre, of the entire lot that she would soon or in the future build a house on. So as we met I was on the phone, they were in-house. We do not have anything in our ordinance to date that addresses RV parks. The closest thing we have is a campground. So we had lots of discussion back and forth over, is a RV park the same as a campground? So really and truly, what I want to say completely in the forefront, tonight is not a night for any decisions to be made. This property owner has written an email that indicated that she would like to move forward with this. However, she has not submitted an official application. I'm not even 100% sure she's received it. So if I may read to you the email that she wrote, which I do believe that all commission members received this email in part of the read aheads. This email was apparently dated on the 15th. No, actually, I don't have a date. She writes, hello, my name is Lilia Cano. I own the property identified as lot 40326 on San Marcos Highway in Martindale, Texas. I would like to install an RV park on part of my property, which would be available for travelers and tourists needing a temporary place to stay. This would have an economic benefit for the city of Martindale and local businesses. Last Monday, I had a meeting at City Hall office to discuss my project. Documents were provided to me regarding zoning change, Chapter 155.041, and variance, Chapter 155.042. And I was instructed to request the applications from the zoning administrator. I am hereby fully requesting the application forms and the rates that would apply in both cases. Thank you for your time and consideration. So that came in to the mayor. He then forwarded it, which triggered us or myself to bring Mr. Ramsey into the loop and explain to the best of my ability at that time the project and what she was looking for. In a moment, I will let Mr. Ramsey give us his remarks about the project as he knows it. But in the meantime, I would like Jared, if you will, to sort of reiterate what we feel like, what we determined in that meeting in December that really needs to be considered by the commission, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so there's the significant issue that we have on this one is the interpretation of the current zoning regulations and how best to apply it. Whether we consider an RV park a commercial use or a campground type land use, those two things have different permitted uses within our use table. In this case, it's very clear that the current zoning, which is R2, which is a manufactured home district, does not permit either of those. And so one way or another, a zoning change would be required, and if that activity were to take place as a permitted land use. Does that capture everything for you, Lisa?
Yes. And so for the basis of discussion, because like I said, there's really not any action that could even I don't feel like there's any action in regards to this lady's particular project. We could make some action in another direction. But I have a question for the commission as we go through this. I would like to hear from each commission member as to what you feel like, if there is a difference in your mind between a campground and an RV park? As in, we need to talk about possibly including RV parks in our ordinance. And if so, what zone would that be? At this point, campgrounds are permitted in C1 in commercial, which is a little odd, but that is the way that it is. So if I may, if anybody would like to go first, I'm thinking Sonia.
I'm gonna wait a little bit. I'm gonna let somebody else go first. I'm still getting my thoughts.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Jan?
The one thing that I was concerned about were the deed restrictions that they have on the property. Does that include the property that this woman is talking about, the deed restrictions?
It
Because
does.
it limited the amount of structures you could put on there and how they were going to be.
So
you know,
I am going to defer that to Mr. Ramsey in just a moment.
Okay.
But so that we can sort of stay on track, do
Okay.
you feel like there is a difference between an RV park and a campground? Do you feel like we need to have both of those listed, or do you feel like an RV park is a campground?
Well, sort of. But a lot of the RV parks need sewage. Now, campgrounds, I would say, would need water also. But I think you put with RVs, I think you need sewage and water and have them like hookups kind of thing.
Correct.
That's the way I
Correct.
see them.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I would say separate.
Yeah, in our previous
Okay.
council meetings, when I was seeking direction on doing the initial revisions of our use table and clarifying our definitions, it was a sense of council at that time that those were separate land uses, distinct land uses.
Mhm.
Thank you for that
Well,
reminder.
you can kind of have a combination
was-
RV and campground. So
Mhm.
I don't know if that's what
You-
you're
you-
planning on doing. You can have primitive camping with tents and then also have a spot for your RV.
I think in her project, it was, at this point, she only identified RV spots, for recreational vehicles or motorhomes.
Did she add, did
So,
she, how many she was going to put, was thinking about putting up?
she brought in a very kind of a back of a napkin type sketch, and was thinking about 20. And so and you'll hear from Mr. Ramsey his opinion about the process that she will have to go through. So Jared, and thank you for reminding me about the council. Was that before or after we have Councilmember McLeod and Clinton back on?
That was our December meeting, or it was in December prior to. So yeah, they're both on council at that time.
Okay, so if that is the case, then I guess the next question would be, as campgrounds are currently permitted in C1, if and so where would the commission like to see RV parks permitted? And so again, kind of a round robin.
I think that's gonna, like depend on the area, that's already established, because I mean, like, as far as thinking about neighbors in the area, I mean, just having a campground in the middle of a neighborhood, I don't see like people, welcoming that. I don't see it. I just don't see it happening. I know that we've stayed in an area before that has like mobile homes, but off to the side where there was no homes, there was an area for campground. We stayed in an area like that, but I don't think in an area where there's already established homes that, that would fly. Another thing that I want to say is I think we're trying to like break it down too much when we're going through campgrounds, RV parks, you know, whatever. Whatever we're talking about, whether it's cabins, whether it's, you know, gonna be whatever, it's lodging. Lodging can fall into RV parks, cabins, it could fall into different things. It depends on the amount of dwellings, the detached cabins or cottages, and you know, an RV park is an RV park, you know what I mean? But I think whenever we're
Yes.
trying to, do, like, you know, this is a campground, this is this, I think if we break it down under lodging and then say this all falls under there, these are the requirements, then that just kind of like, you know, puts it under one general area, and then you have your different areas to decipher what exactly it is.
I see. All right. Thank you for sharing that. Commission member McLeod or Clinton, would either of you like to weigh in?
Sure, Lisa. I agree. We probably should put campground and RVs under commercial. I would agree with that.
Okay.
And maybe Mr. Ramsey can clarify this. I guess my two concerns on this particular project is the capacity of the septic tank. You know, if you got one septic tank and you got 20 RVs, that seems a little over the top, you know, on that capacity level. And also, have the neighbors in that area expressed concerns? And I guess that would be my 2 points to make.
Right. And for the fact to follow up on those statements, thank you very much. Jared, on what you have posted, can you mark on the screen which one of these parcels is lot number 6?
It's 326, is that
So
right?
while he is,
Oh,
yes.
Lisa, I got one more point. I'm sorry. One more point.
Yeah.
Are these in the, I mean, I know we've had these floodplain maps changed, and I assume that, or maybe Rob knows or Jared, that are we under the 2015 maps yet?
That's on the agenda item tonight.
Okay, sir. That's it. All right.
Per FEMA, it all began on January 1 or December 31st.
Okay,
actually.
answers my question. Thank you, sir.
So I think, first of all, let me give opportunity for Sam Clinton. Would you like to weigh in?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to address your first question about camping and RV. There is a distinct difference between camping and having an RV site. I consider a campground more of a temporary place to stay. RV, you can stay there for longer term, perhaps even a month. And you do need more of a utility infrastructure, as Mike mentioned. Either the RVs would have to have a pump out location or have a bigger septic tank. Also with an RV park, you'll have more impervious ground cover, perhaps with the RV sites combined with the roads that you would need to access each RV site. You don't typically need as much road or impervious surfaces in a campground, but I do agree that it should be in commercial zoning. I did drive out there to West Ridge today, and I saw that there are some people living closer to Highway 80. And so I think, as Sonia mentioned, they might not like it as much if there's such a dense, more activity created so close in proximity to other homeowners who bought these sites many years ago, buying larger sites of land, thinking that they would have privacy. But we also have to consider the commercial zoning that's adjacent to it. And I think that would be the question. Do we want to extend the commercial zoning in just those lots on 80? That's the main question in my mind.
How big is the area?
I'm sorry?
How big is the area? How many acres is it?
That lot's 5.01, 5 acres.
And so
And
that
they're wanting, what, 25?
20.
8
And-
times 5, 40 acres.
And so they wanted to do 20 and 4 acres, and then they wanted to keep an acre for the land, for their home.
5 per acre.
Estimated, yes. So, I lost my train of thought.
Another comment.
Yes,
I think with the application, and this is also specific use,
mhm,
so they're going to need a specific use. So they're going to have to ask all the neighbors anyway. They're going to have to do a little survey
absolutely.
for the neighbors.
So
Uh,
I think this
I
is a
did
point.
go down there today also
Mhm,
and talked to one of the neighbors that was out, and they said that they had heard that that's what this property owner was planning on doing. It looks like a couple of the lots on the other side are not developed.
mhm.
It was kind of hard to tell, but it looked like a pretty widespread area, and I wasn't sure I was in the right spot. So,
Correct.
but it looked like there were several of those, maybe 2 or 3 of the lots that were together that didn't look like they were quite yet developed. Is there
Right.
also sewage and water there from Martindale Sewage and Martindale Water?
There is not.
No sewage.
No
There-
sewage.
there's not. So all of those lots are on septic if in fact they have been improved. I think at this point, I would like to ask Mr. Ramsey to weigh in and really and truly, if you would just either read or tell us your comments that you had sent via email about this project and the things that you know that she'll have to go through.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Let's see, it's already been discussed that with the current zoning R2, it would not be applicable for a RV park. So if commercial district, C1 commercial district is selected, then that could work with the Planning and Zoning Commission approval. There would be a variance request for the RV park use in a C1 district, and also a separate specific use permit would be required.
Mhm.
Now, as each of you would know, any zoning change request is discretionary to the city.
Mhm.
So with that in mind, you can ask or require any documentation for the proposed use.
Mhm.
In this case, I believe it would be prudent to consider a site plan, a preliminary site plan to show the layout more than what was shown on a napkin.
Mhm.
Show the layout of the proposed 20 spaces, the impervious cover, the office building, stormwater detention is going to be required for the impervious cover. There's a lot of issues, engineering aspects that could be addressed with the preliminary site plan for the commission's consideration.
Mhm.
Yeah. In addition to that, I would like to also point out that a TxDOT driveway permit is going to be required.
Mhm.
And TxDOT is not going to allow each individual lot to have each separate driveway to Highway 80. There's just not enough separation. So there's going to need to be something worked out with the adjacent owners. And my recommendation is that this property owner go have some initial preliminary meetings with TxDOT to work out access to Highway 80.
Do you remember, if I may ask really quickly, is it 400 feet between driveways or entrances on a state highway?
Yeah, yes, based on the design speed, in this case, it'd be 425 feet
425.
measured from inside to inside of the driveway.
Okay. All right.
Plus they have to have an exit too, and you have to be able to go in, and then no, I think you have to have a separate exit, but I think they may have some kind of easement in the back.
All that would have to be determined
Yes.
in the preliminary plat. And so, lastly, did you have more, Mr. Ramsey?
Well, regarding the septic, yes, it would be permitted through the Caldwell County Health Department, But there could be the consideration of one consolidated septic system and drain field for the RV park.
Mhm,
But again, that gets back to the preliminary site plan layout.
mhm. Okay, thank you. Thank you for all of that. And I appreciate you staying on in case we have some of those engineering kinds of questions.
I also have a question.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
wanted to know about, what about the potable water system
Mhm.
and the backflow? You know, the backflow prevention device and, you know, so the potable water.
Well, that is under Martindale Water Supply does service that area. So she would have to coordinate with Martindale Water Supply to get however many taps would be necessary to accommodate the number that she would like to have on slips.
And then the dumping station.
And like Mr. Ramsey said, it's possible that she could have one, obviously that would be very large, septic system. So I think it would just depend, and that's not just through Caldwell County. They have to coordinate directly with the state for septic to make certain that it is all up to spec.
Are we, may I make a comment?
Yes, ma'am.
Are we even considering possibly maybe adding a specific use for R2 under campground?
That's something for us to discuss.
In a different meeting,
Oh,
or is it this?
I think that's kind of where we are, if I'm understanding you correctly, to look at the fact that RV parks are not permitted in any zone in the city. The closest thing is a campground, and campground is only permitted in C1. So the location where this property is not C1. So even a campground would have to, she would, in order to be conforming, she would, and that's why her inquiry was to request a zoning change. Now, I will say
Let me
this.
interrupt right quick. Miss Cannell did arrive. She's here now, so.
Oh, good. Thank you. Well, welcome. And I know that Sonia will, I'm sorry, Sylvia will help interpret if in fact she has any questions or we want to ask her directly. So the fact that this particular parcel does not abut the C1 district, which is in green on the map on the screen, you can only see a little bit of the green. Sam Clinton made a good point in, there's what we want to avoid is we want to avoid what is called spot zoning, where if in fact we were to take her parcel, which is in essence two parcels down from C1 and allow or approve for just her parcel to be C1. Well, that's called spot zoning, and it happens in places, but it's not recommended. It really doesn't flow well when you're thinking of future planning as a big picture. And so the comment and potential notion that Sam Clinton brought to the table is, would we consider the notion of converting or changing that entire strip of parcels that all face Highway 80, possibly to turn it into C1. I believe Jared was looking at sort of the Google view, the Google map view of that property. There's only two dwellings in all of those. Let me pull up my map. Is that, I believe, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 parcels that front Highway 80. And it looks to me that there's only a couple of houses out there already.
Lisa.
Yes.
I got a question for Mr. Ramsey.
Go right ahead.
Mr. Ramsey, I know those those manufactured homes were under the, I guess, the floodplain map of 2000, whatever. So they're grandfathered in. So with this RV park development, would it have to come under the 2015 floodplain maps? That's my question. Since it's a new project.
Yes, sir. My opinion is that it would.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Mhm.
Mike, we're looking at the maps that just became effective, paper maps, and looks to me like all of Westridge is outside the flood zone.
Okay.
I don't
Dead
think
issue
flooding's going to be an issue there.
That's a dead issue then. Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. So
Have we
this is,
discussed the deed restriction?
Not yet.
okay, so let me front that, and then I'm gonna ask Mr. Ramsey to weigh in on it. Having the opportunity to provide us with the declaration of covenants and reading through that, Jan, you're correct. It appears on the surface that you can't subdivide those properties. I did ask Mr. Ramsey to kind of dig a little deeper within those documents. And I would like for you, Mr. Ramsey, to kind of tell us what you found in regards to a loophole.
Well, based off my reading of the deed restrictions, there was a section towards the end of the deed restrictions that did allow a loophole for the city to consider.
Mm-hmm.
I do not have that document in front of me right now. I'm going on memory, but I do recall that was the case.
All right. And was that in I had sent you, I believe, no, that is in the declaration. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. And it was toward the end of the document.
All right. I have one in front of me.
See, I have one.
While they're looking, Kent, are you up? You still on? Mr. Waymore?
Let me try to unmute him.
If we can get him on the
All right, Kent, you should be live.
I'm here.
So the question is the history behind this is Westridge was developed, created with a developer, split all those lots were subdivided, et cetera. And then somewhere around 2000, I think, the year 2000, 1999, 96, somewhere along there, they petitioned to become into the city. And
Right.
this covenant that showed up was part of their deeds, I think.
Can you make it larger?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So the question is this thing still legal? Is this binding? What?
Let me, okay, so when I'm looking at this screen, I'm not seeing, let's see, right to run with land. Who do the restrictive covenants run in favor of and bind?
Say it again?
Who did the restrictive covenants run in favor of and bind? Can you go to the top of the document? You're down at the bottom. Okay, got it. So this is a subdivision. So the restrictive covenants only run in favor of someone who owns a portion of the restricted land. It's merely a contract that purports to bind the behavior of people that own a portion of the restricted land. So unless those have been amended in accordance with the Texas property code, they would still be valid. Now, I don't know. We would have to have a title search done, and I'm guessing the city doesn't want to do that. But if those documents appear in the chain of title as unmodified, then they would still bind that property.
I will tell you that the way that I was able to obtain these covenants was from a different property owner on a different project wanting to subdivide.
Yeah,
And
I mean, we have no clue. They may be valid, they may have been modified, they may have been terminated, they may have been expanded. We simply don't know. Now, you've got to look at this as two things simultaneously happening. Just because a restrictive covenant says something, that doesn't prohibit a city from doing what it wants to do. If someone that owns the land that is bound by these restrictive covenants asks the city for permission and the city says, yeah, go do whatever you want to do, but the restrictive covenants say something contrary, then the other property owners that are also bound by these restrictive covenants can then independently seek to enforce them. But that doesn't have any bearing on what the city does.
Mhm.
There's a section 4.03 on this deed, whatever you call it.
Declaration of
That says duration and amendment. It says it looks like it only lasts 20 years. Ask the owner how long she's had the property.
I don't think it's about how long the owners had the property. I think it's about when these were filed, which was in 1999.
Oh. So that's over 20 years.
Correct.
So, and it's
Yeah,
Where did you
there's
see that,
normally an automatic extension provision in restrictive covenants.
And so I feel like we as a city, you know, because this is,
oh, it's automatically extended for a success of 10 10 years each. Okay.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's pretty standard.
Okay.
I feel like, I mean, literally within the same 3-week time frame, this property owner and another property owner came forward wanting to subdivide. There is another property that I do not believe he has submitted his application yet, but I do know he has engineers working on it. That is not one of these parcels, it's behind. And it's a situation where one person owns 7 acres and wants to sell 2.5. And so the reason that I was able to, you know, I couldn't answer that question for that potential future property owner until we were able to see what the subdivision covenant stated. And so so we're going to have to figure out. So Kent, I'm really kind of shining this to your direction. We're going to have to figure out, because if I don't want to encourage someone to do something that later is going to backlash on us. And at the same time, I don't want to shut somebody down that could have.
Yeah,
So
I mean, but a city can't have liability simply by granting a variance or you know, zoning property in a particular manner. Because again, restrictive covenants are really, for lack of a better term, a contract between landowners that are all bound by the restrictive covenants. That's not within our purview.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the city's not going to get in trouble for changing zoning classifications or granting a variance. That landowner could then go to the neighboring landowners and say, well, hey, listen, I'd like to, I got approval from the city to do this. Can you guys agree that I can do this? And the other landowners may say yes or no. They may or may not enforce the restrictive covenants. You just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. You know, one thing that I thought about, just that whole notion of not falling into spot zoning. And so as I feel like if this moves forward, and I have spoken with the property owner at hand, even again today, and she does want to move forward with this project. So we as a council/commission are going to have to sort of figure out which way we would want that property owner to submit their application. Would it be to change the zone so that she could do an RV park, but then that puts it in a spot zoning situation? Or would we look at the possibility of rezoning all of those 8 parcels that front Highway 80? And then it would just continue, including the scenic corridor, I would expect would continue. Then those property owners would have the ability to to do something that would generate income other than, I guess you can put cattle out there or whatever. I'm sorry.
I found that section that I think Mr. Ramsey was looking at. It's 4.05. I think
Okay.
you ought to look at it. It's short, but it mentions Martindale, Texas in the official records for Caldwell County.
What does it say?
The declarant reserves the right to assign the city of Martindale, Texas, any or all of the rights reserved to the declarant hereunder, which assignment shall be effective on the date such assignment is filed of record in the official records of Caldwell County.
I'm not sure what
You
that
want
means.
to decipher that, Kent?
Yeah.
So who is the declarant? Has the declarant's period of control expired? And if it has not, has the assignment occurred? Or if the declarant still exists, does Martindale want to acquire those rights? I would say Martindale would be biting off into a can of worms, having the ability to enforce these restrictive covenants. We've got our code of ordinances, and I think that's more than we want anyway.
And I will tell you, the other property owner that is looking to just buy a section, a portion of one of those parcels.
Yes.
When I said, your deed restrictions set, or your, covenants say that you are not supposed to be able to subdivide. So this gentleman literally dug into it. He went out into the neighborhood and he took pictures and documented every, what do you call it? Violation.
Yes.
Of the, so he's, his point, which is not necessarily what we're dealing with, but just giving a little backstory, is he said, nobody follows the rules. Now, that's not the reason to move forward and continue to not follow the rules, but it certainly gives a little bit of credence to what people think out there. So.
Yeah, I agree. And there is no clear or hard and fast standard under the law for how many violations constitute a waiver of restrictive covenants. But I mean, again,
there's no one enforcing these covenants.
Right. And quite frankly, we wouldn't have to take the assignment. We wouldn't have to take the assignment anyway. So if the city wants to say, we'll let you do this, or we won't let you do this, that is completely separate and apart. And then if someone else wants to enforce this, more power to them if they want to.
Great. I appreciate that information. And does everyone understand basically that our city attorney has said, if we're not going to be liable, and if a property owner wants to subdivide and or request a zoning change, there's not going to be any backlash if we allow them to go through that process. They will have to check all the boxes and go through the process the way our ordinances state that they have to.
I just wanted to add that I know that you said the owner went out and took pictures and documented about stuff, but what I'm concerned with is how does it read at the CCAD? Like, are these like legit subdivided parcels that's recorded, in the county offices, or are these just, pictures that, that he took that the houses there are, or is it like legitimately subdivided?
Okay, so it is a legitimate subdivision that was recorded in 1999, West Ridge Estates. And when the developer who went through the process and did the subdivision, thank you, Jared, for showing that map. Basically, I think it's standard for a subdivision to have covenants, to have, quote, rules. Typically, they would then be turned over to the HOA, the homeowners association. Well, this particular subdivision has never had an official HOA. So the developer did what was standard by developing and including the declaration of covenants with it. And then he sold off the parcels, and that was it. And at some point, though, the entire subdivision requested to come into the city limits.
So I get that, but I was talking about the gentleman that you said went and within their property subdivided it. That's what you said?
He has not done that yet. He has not purchased the property because the questions and notions here at hand, you know, he doesn't want to put money, he doesn't want to buy a piece of property that he cannot officially subdivide and have recorded. And so that was why he dug in. And that was why I asked Mr. Ramsey, you know, is there a loophole that any given parcel could be subdivided? Because these are not 1 acre tracts. These are 3+ acre. Some of them are 5. One of them is 7. I believe the tract that was talking about was 7 acres.
5.
Lisa, I had a question for you in terms of R2 and the uses that we are trying to determine for R2, and that camping and RV is not in R2, but what if we change the use of R2 without having to change the zoning? And I thought of that, but then if we said R2 you could have campgrounds or RV, that could stretch from the Highway 80 all the way to the ends of that development there. So if we just change the zoning, then that, and then said that RV and camping could only be, say, in a certain zone, then that would limit the possibility just to the corridor, our commercial corridor.
Correct. It minimizes the entanglement. Also, that this particular area being zoned R2 is not the only R2 in town. There are other areas where manufactured homes are permitted. And so if in fact we were to change the use table to permit RV parks and or campgrounds in R2 overall in general, you're right. Those could potentially pop up anywhere that is in that zone.
Isn't there R2 there at Westridge? They can have farm, ranch, or orchard, though, in their restricted covenant. Did I hear something about that, that they are allowed to have a farm, ranch, or orchard in their R2 zoning?
Yes, I read that.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that supersede city ordinances? Ken?
City ordinance.
No, Rob's right. That is a city ordinance. Whatever they can.
Permitted in R2 in Martindale.
It's not in our R2, it's in their R2, I thought.
Oh,
Well,
in their declaration of covenants, it says that if they want to run cattle, they can.
Yes.
And I don't know how much of that is already happening out
They're
there. Limited to 2 livestock?
2 or 2 cattle.
Let me say this. We could tell this subdivision that they can build Yankee Stadium or the Eiffel Tower if we want. We can give them permission to do whatever they want. And if they start doing it, then one of those other landowners out there could say, hold on, you're doing something. So don't confuse these two things.
Good.
Just because their document says something doesn't mean it has any bearing on the city.
Great, thank you for that explanation.
I still don't understand which one overrides what.
They coexist.
Yeah.
They coexist, but because no one has enforced it. In other words, if we want to grant or give permission for either a zone change or permitting a particular use in there, the only potential backlash would be another property owner who would then, you know, file a complaint and basically what Ken is saying is that they would have to do that at their own personal expense. They would have to bring their case.
Go into some nice neighborhood in the city of Austin, like, I don't know, the Barton Creek area. If someone wants to build a pool in their backyard, they've got to get approval from their HOA, who's enforcing restrictive covenants, but then they've also got to get a permit from the city of Austin and meet those requirements. And just because the city of Austin might be more or less stringent, doesn't change what the restrictive covenants say. So insofar as the restrictive covenants don't violate state law, they're allowable. And so whoever buys this property or whatever they want to do, they're going to have two contentions. One is getting approval from the city. The other is not running afoul of the restrictive covenants and also satisfying their neighbors. How they do that, that's fine. But to the extent that there were contradictory provisions, then arguably that gets more technical, but the cities could override in some circumstances. We're not dealing with that here.
And so what Jared has up on the screen in C campground currently, according to our ordinances, is only, it's really not even, it's not permitted anywhere except in C1 with a specific use permit. So that is where Mr. Ramsey was saying, if that the properties in, now follow Sam Clinton's notion of, say, for hypothetical, if the city chose to change the zone of all 8 of those Highway 80 frontage lots to C1, then any property owner, including the property owner at hand, would have to submit a specific use permit to have an RV park or a campground on her property. And as we've just come off of going through the specific use permit process, we all know that that entails triggering a public hearing that would require every property owner within 200 feet to be given notice by a letter letting them know that, you know, this, number one, if in fact we were to do the zoning change, they would be notified. And if in fact any individual property owner would want to do a specific use permit, the property owners in 200 feet would also be notified. So the surrounding neighbors are going to be informed, and they have the ability to, you know, come out against or for. Go ahead, Jan.
Wouldn't it be, see, it just seems like it would be easier just to allow R2s to have, to submit a specific use permit if they wanted to do a campground or RV.
I would recommend against it.
Why?
Because it's not congruent with the rest of the use within that table. So that district is set up to be a residential use, and having campgrounds is not, I would not consider that to be a residential use. If you're trying to put, when you're looking at zoning, you're trying to limit congestion, create a high quality of life, provide for basic services, utility services and things, having that planning out, making RV parks or campgrounds available in R2. I mean, you could have that opens up a lot of issues where you're going to have within neighborhoods an RV park, and I don't think that would serve the residents of our city very well.
I would also like to add that I think we need to be putting a focus on RV park standards instead of trying to find loopholes in how to change our zoning. Earlier it said there was a loophole that this could be done. But there's things that, you know, if we're getting calls about this, then we need to be spending time, or planning and zoning needs to spend time on, you know, the number of lots per acre with an RV park shall not exceed, you know, each lot shall be designated and constructed. Like, that should be our focus right now, is getting this together rather than trying to figure out how to zone it commercial. Because it just sounds like we don't have any organization at all with what we want in our RV parks.
That's going to be on the agenda once we get in the council session.
And you are exactly right, Sonia. And so
so I think that's where our emphasis should be.
I think for this,
Uh-oh.
Lisa, we're losing you.
One point, I want to totally agree with Jared. I totally agree with your previous statement.
Add RV park to the with the specific use it income still with a specific use permit, and completely that we should go through.
You were still losing you again.
I don't know if you can hear us, Lisa, but you are about every third syllable is dropping out. So we don't know what you're saying.
Here's a sample one that I've been studying,
Okay.
and it could be.
And she's gone.
Do we want to hear from the owner?
So Jared, from what may I speak? Do y'all mind?
Sure.
So are you recommending that we try making those Highway 80 parcels of land commercial?
I think if we're going to rezone those parcels of land commercial, I think we should do it with a more strategic objective in mind rather than permitting an RV park on one lot.
Right. Okay.
I think that if we're going to rezone those lots, we should have a specific vision in mind of what we intend to achieve with that. Commercial has specific uses, office buildings, restaurants, what have you. And I think it's about 50-50 between developed and undeveloped in those, maybe even less than that, maybe it's 40-60 or 30-70, but there's still some level of development that's taking place out there.
Yeah.
And I guess it's for the city council to consider whether that continuing use was something that would be desired, or you would want to rezone it. But rezoning is going to have a lot of issues because you're now saying that you're going to permit that continuing non-conforming use for those people who are using those plots as a residence. And you're going to intermix those uses over the course of the next 50 years.
Right.
You know, until those, or even longer potentially.
The way the deed reads, it sounds like, you know, they wanted to keep, the purpose was to keep those lots big. So, you know, which is going to be kind of an advantage instead of making it, you know, I guess a future RV park.
Yeah. So my recommendation would be if you're going to consider a rezoning, you have a specific goal in mind that you're trying to achieve with it other than a single application.
Yeah, Jared, I totally agree with you on that, 100%. Good point.
But at the same case, we have commercial zoning already along 80, and we haven't even addressed that and the uses that could be used in that kind of thing. So now you're saying we need to address that if we change it, but we haven't even addressed it, what we currently have.
Part of the problem with some of our C1 zoning is that it's in floodway areas or floodplain areas, I should say. So that limits some development that you have with those creeks running through, as you see on this screen here. The rest of it, you know, if you can, you would want your commercial districts to be somewhat dense. That way it provides for easy, you know, walkability if you're going from one shop to the next. You want a store here and then quarter mile down the road, another store there. So I don't think we're not running out of commercial space within the city's boundary. I think we still have plenty of commercial space. I don't know if we have a real need to consider adding to that land use.
All right, now, are we going to talk about this in the regular city council meeting? And Lisa needs to be unmuted.
She's on mute. Okay. Hold on, let me get her set up.
What we're going to talk in the regular city council meeting that's coming up is the definitions and, you know, discuss, you know, a little bit that she hit on here of should we have an RV line in the use table, those kind of questions. So we're going to get there, but the issue here is we have a resident or a landowner that's in the city that has said, hey, I want to use my property. We owe that lady an answer.
Correct.
Well,
Correct. We definitely need to figure it out. And I'm sorry, I could hear a lot of things that were going on, but I was stuck in timeout when my internet blinked and I had to come back in. So so if I may just confirm, you know, I think y'all were talking about where we might want to go next. Is that to consider rezoning? Is that to consider adding RV parks with a specific use permit? I just want to make sure I understand where the commission is leaning.
well, it looks like the only options is either to change to R1 or add a specific use permit for the campground / RV, which will have to change on the chart anyway.
What you mean change to C1?
Or R1.
To change to C1 for commercial, is that correct?
Change to C1 is one option, or put a specific use under the RT for campgrounds and RVs.
Okay, I think I understand what you are saying. And so
Are not permitted at all.
One thing that I did want to make a comment on is that, you know, when we entertained in a positive moving forward way, the developer with Summer Breeze, you know, that was also on Highway 80 frontage. So what I am seeing, what I can consider to be a trend at this point, would be that that property lends itself to that particular use as an RV, you know, or you know, an RV park in general, whether it's a high-end resort or just you know, 20 slips on a property. One thing that I will and would like to share is that the property owner that we were talking about tonight, she did indicate that she does not have a desire for these RV spots to be long-term. She has a desire for them to be short-term. The other part that I want to bring in is that's a business. So that is where the use fits in a C1 zone. And then the other part is that it does generate the hotel motel 7% tax when they are not long-term. So that's where my thoughts are in regards to the fact that it is a business.
I totally agree, Lisa.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
So, you know, I think what we need to tell the property owner is come up with a little bit more detailed plans and resubmit and submit the applications. We can check with the neighbors and go from there.
And the kicker is she could submit a zoning change request. You know, I wouldn't be all for it and the only way I would be for it is if we as a city looked at all of those frontage properties. You know, if we really dug in, not a spot zone, you know, in between. So, but we can't prevent her from requesting that, and we would have to go through the process if she did.
Like, why as a planning and zoning commission are we, you know, having to make decisions like this with no plans?
Because
like no,
right.
We don't have any, you know, like the thing between Summer Breeze and with this is like Summer Breeze came in, they had their plans, this was gonna happen, and this, you know, we don't have any of that information.
Right. And so whether we actually get that information or not, you know, the amount of people that have inquired about it, I think gives credence to, as a council, for us to, because it's not up to the quote commission, even though we all know it's all the same people, but under P&Z to make those type of ordinance and or zoning changes. That's the actual council. So that would be done in a council meeting and a P&Z meeting.
My suggestion for the commission to consider is if if you're not prepared to change the zoning for all of them, then we shouldn't bother this person's time and having them run around and come up with detailed plans and spend money and time and resources on doing something like that if the commission is not prepared to consider a rezoning of all of those lots.
I agree. And just for the understanding, for a project this size, if Mr. Ramsey is still on,
I am.
I would expect, and please correct me, you know, for a person to take this project to an engineering firm and ask for some type of official plat that they could then submit with an application would cost anywhere from, if it's a 5-acre lot, it could cost anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 just for them to get something to present, not even something that's finalized. Is that about right?
At the minimum, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so that gives more credibility to what Jared stated, that we as a commission / council, we need to do our work before we ask somebody else to go spend $10,000 just to see if we kind of might maybe.
Exactly.
So are there any other questions or comments about any of this for tonight?
No,
No.
not for me.
Okay. And so thank you all very much. I think this was good, healthy conversation. And I think we've got a little bit of direction when we go into our regular meeting. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn the planning and zoning meeting.
A second?
I
Well,
second.
Lisa, did you know that the owner of the land is here in the room with us?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I believe we've covered everything. I should have introduced her before.
Okay.
Does she have any comment?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Does Lilia have any comments? Sylvia, can you ask her before we leave?
She does not have any comments.
Okay, thank you. So I have a motion to adjourn and a second by whom?
Yes.
By Mike, second by
Yes.
Mike, all in favor. Sonia,
Aye.
Sam,
Aye.
and I. This meeting is adjourned at 7:40. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Lisa.
Mhm.
Now moving on to the regular council meeting. We will need to, you're still recording over there, I guess. Let's have a roll call. Mayor Pro Tem Villalobos.
Here.
Councilmember Bunker.
Here.
Councilmember Michelle Allen.
Here.
Councilmember DeKalb.
Here.
Councilmember Clinton.
Here.
And Mayor DeVinny is present. All right. We will not do the Pledge of Allegiance. We're going to forego that since we already done it. We have, anybody got any public comments? Sign up? Nope. So we go to reports and announcements. Chief was out on quarantine last week, and so there's a request for the blotter. It is here and available, and the chief is here to ask questions of, so talk to us, Harry.
If you have questions, I'm here to answer them.
I don't think we got a copy of it. Can you put it up on the screen?
Yeah, I'm working on it.
We're working on it.
No, they're gonna put it up on the screen. I'll get you on
So,
that.
well, no, if somebody has a question, I might have to look at a number.
Did it come from you or come from Sylvia?
The blotter, I emailed it to Sylvia.
Is there anything that you could report? Harry, is there anything you could report?
One of the main things that y'all might have a question on, I had a night where I had to come out where I ended up making a DWI arrest as well as a felony family violence arrest. That was the biggest thing we had in December.
Well, I don't have any questions.
Well, the reason we got a dead air here is Sylvia went up to go email it to Jared so he could put it on the screen, but if
Hey, Mayor, I've got a quick question for Harry.
okay.
Hey, Harry, I walk that dog every day, and a couple of nights ago, I heard some gunfire. It sounded like it was upstream of me. I don't know exactly where it was. It was late at night. And then I was walking over at the San Marcos River Ranch, the last house in the subdivision before you go to Barbara Hall's driveway. She said that she's had constant problems with gunfire from somebody across the river. She has contacted Guadalupe County Sheriff, and they have checked and gotten some bullets out of their pier. They've got a river pier, and they've had bullets in there. And she was asking what we could do as a city, and I said, did you contact Caldwell County? And she said something about that's not their jurisdiction or something. So I was going to bring that up to you, Harry. Maybe you want to check into it, because that could be a potential problem, even though it's not occurring in our city limits, but it is in our ETJ.
Yeah, yes, sir. We've actually had a couple of calls of gunfire up where you're talking about, as well as across the river there, 1979 at the River Bridge over there in Guadalupe County. I've called the sheriff's department numerous times to get them to go out and check it out. Just if you speak with her, anytime that's going on, they can call me and we can try to coordinate something to try to find somebody. Because if bullets are actually hitting structures, then we need to trace down where they're coming from.
Is this dock down there by the dam?
No, it's right. You know where it's one of the newest piers put in. It's probably, where I live. It's on the other side, and it's right about it's the last house in the subdivision going towards Martindale before you enter Barbara Hall's long driveway. They got a really nice rock pier that they put in a couple of years ago, and the Guadalupe County has been there, and they have dug bullets out. She thinks it's a 9mm, so they do have some bullets, and Guadalupe County is aware of it. But she's greatly concerned, and we have heard gunfire, what she was talking about. And I don't know, it's coming downstream of my place somewhere.
Yeah, we've actually, myself and as well as some of the officers while they're on duty at night have actually heard that exact gunfire that you're talking about. I'll coordinate with Guadalupe County, and if you would talk with them, if they hear it, encourage them to get a hold of us.
Okay.
So we can try to get something coordinated, try to find out who is shooting.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Clint?
What does UTL mean?
Unable to locate.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine.
And ATL is attempt to locate.
Okay. That's it. That's all I have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ms. Allen, do you have any questions, ma'am?
No, sir.
All right, that wraps up Chief's report. Let's go to the item 5A. 5A is discussion action to change it to the flood damage prevention ordinance number 153.07. That will be the one that's titled ordinance number 2021-01-19-01. So if y'all remember, we have a ordinance called flood damage prevention. In it, in section 153.07, it refers to the maps that FEMA puts out. For whatever reason, when it was originally written, they identified the maps by the date codes. Of course, as we've talked earlier tonight, effective 12/31/2020, the new maps became effective. And therefore, we need to update this ordinance from the June 19th, 2012 maps to the December 30th, 2020 maps. and that's what it's for. And that's the only change we're proposing here. Any questions?
So in the copy of the ordinance we have, there are line items that are struck out. So
No, forget that. That, you had tracking,
that has nothing to do with
that has
this.
nothing to do with this. Just look at the one on the screen, or
Okay. No, it's fine.
the stuff highlighted in red was the only thing that was changing.
Okay.
I so moved to accept.
I'll second.
Okay. Lisa, seconds. Anybody else want to talk? Mike, what do you say you?
I say
Yay or
yay.
nay?
You got a yay for me.
Okay, Jan
Yay.
and Sam.
Yay, accepted.
Passes 5-0. Thank you. The next one is this action on ordering the May 21st, 2020 elections. That is what you see on the other ordinance that is now on the screen, I believe. It's got 3 places. We talked about this was coming. This is a little bit different because after studying with the county and the San Marcos Independent School District, we think the best course of action is for us to handle this ourselves. Of course, we're utilizing Pam Ohlendorf as our elections administrator out of this. And we are moving out to go off and go make this happen, but we need to have the council go order the election. We've done a couple of things in the past. If we have a general election, Kent, you got to keep me straight on this one now. If we have a general election, it's got to be done by the council. If we have a special election, then the mayor orders it on his own recognizance, I guess. And so this is all general election stuff. Therefore, we need this ordinance. This is pretty much verbatim from
That's part of it. But the thing that's thrown us off the last couple of elections is the de-annexation effort. That is called by order of the mayor. So that's largely what's necessitated that. Plus, you had the authority to look at moving the election date as well.
Okay.
So I'd like to make a motion that the City Council of the City of Martindale, Texas calls a general election to be held on May 1, 2021 for the purpose of electing council members for council, mayor, place 2 and place 5, all for 2-year terms.
I second.
And Sam?
Aye.
And Sonia?
Yeah.
And Mike?
Aye.
Passes 5-0. All right, moving right along. Then on 5C is discussion and possible action on redefining the current definitions of chapter 155.096, which is the use table in the Code of Ordinances, and that brings us back to where we were.
That's right.
All right.
Set us up here for success.
Gary's pulling up lots of stuff.
You're doing a great job.
Let you all watch me work a little bit. All right, so what I'm trying to do here is get a split screen going so we can see the table. There we go. And the definitions as we work through this. So let me get this started the table. And here we go, get down to the definitions. In this document, you'll see track changes. If you're not familiar with word track changes, all items in a red font are changed. If there's a line through the middle of it, that's an edit to remove. If there's a line underneath, that's an edit to add. So I think what we'll go through is go through alphabetically through the list of definitions, and we'll catch everybody up on the use table as we get there. So the first one is that we did not have defined within our use table was an art gallery. An art gallery was previously located with a museum. The definition for art gallery and the definition of museum are somewhat different. For that purpose, I thought it was useful to have those as separate uses, potentially. Where an art gallery is, here the suggestion definition is a building for the display and sale of works of art. So the difference here is the sale, where a museum is just for the exhibition of works of art and other things. And to me, those seemed like different uses. And for that purpose, I made the suggestion, and I'm scrolling down to where it says has a museum defined. A museum is a building in which objects of historical, scientific, artistic, or cultural interest are stored and exhibited. And because of the commercial aspects of a museum versus an art gallery, those two things being different, I'd make the consideration that they be considered different with the recommendation, this is getting us pulled back to where we were, in instituting a new district for recreation within the city of Martindale. This is not currently a use district that's defined, but it would handle, and it does have precedence within our city. It does have precedence elsewhere. Oftentimes, recreational districts are also open space districts, and they could be used to identify special districts for the purposes of having parks, recreation, and campgrounds, and sports facilities or the like. Some places they will zone areas for a golf course as a recreational district. I think Kent might have he might know an example of that. So so that's taken us a long way around, right? So for this reason that I had them separated was if we're going to consider a recreational use, we could consider a museum part of that recreational use, and an art gallery would be therefore different.
And what is the zone called now at the heading of the page?
So I just had it as RE for recreation. So there's three things tied into this issue. As we start with the number one, they all affect each other. One is, do we want to consider an art gallery separate from a museum? Do we concur with those definitions of those two land uses? And then the third is, if they are different, would we want to consider them different for the purposes of districts, with land uses within districts, and would we want to consider a recreational district for the city of Martindale? So I'm just going to hit it up front pretty fast.
Where would you put this recreational district?
So the question was, where would we put this recreational district? So in the past, when the master plan was formed, there were a number of areas that were identified as open spaces. And I want to try to pull a document of that. So here is this was the preliminary zoning district for the city of Martindale back when the comprehensive plan was first envisioned in 1997. Those areas in green were zoned open spaces and agricultural. There's also some other maps. Unfortunately, my scanner broke and I was unable to get it. There are other maps that identified floodplain areas that would basically similar to the open spaces down here in the triangle of 1979 and the parks, where those were set up as an open space for park use. That was kind of like they didn't describe it as such, but it's almost like a park overlay, district overlay, as they could envision it. So what we have here is an example of preliminary zoning back when the comprehensive plan was done. And so the thought is, if we would want to consider, given some of the issues that we have had arise, like today in this conversation about campgrounds and RV parks, like we've had about development near the river, especially near 1979 and elsewhere, would we want to consider an recreational open space use? And that will get us eventually back to the definitions. But so as it could be defined, we start down that process, but I want to pause a little bit.
To me, like most of the green stuff is in areas that were in flood prone areas, which, kind of makes good sense, right?
Yep. Yes, it does.
So when you mean art gallery, you could mean a structure, or do you mean like a weekend art fair where they set up and sell art on easels in the park, or?
An art fair, they would likely fall under our, I want to butcher the word, itinerant vendors, basically day use vendors list. So if we have a farmer's market or an art fair, they have to get a permit to sell their wares on. Basically, like, and right now we handle that as part of an event permit, but we do have regulations that have permitting for street vendors.
But that's currently allowed in the park zone, say, or they just need a permit?
Right now, we don't have a park zone. Our zoning right now, at least
Parkland or
parkland is a permitted use within our zoning structure at districts. There's no specific district just for parks.
okay.
So the idea here is to handle this issue where we're running into what can I do within R1, what can I do within C1. I want, we want to protect areas for open space. We could do that through a new district that we could introduce.
Jared, what is all in it according to our new floodplain maps? Isn't all that area in the floodway now, basically?
The green area?
The
areas in green that you see.
I'm in
map,
the areas the green and yellow, and I'm looking. Here you go. Yeah, the green. Is it extended past that since we got? Is this based on the new floodplain maps?
No, this is the way it was in 97. Right?
Okay. So that would be enlarged. The green area would be enlarged, I would assume, being in a floodway. Correct.
Right. So if we wanted to follow the floodway for that. Now, one of the items that came out of the research was that some cities actually, similar to what we do with the scenic overlay, they have a floodway overlay. In addition to their flood prevention ordinance, as a land use, they will set certain land use restrictions from a zoning perspective, and not just it's related to flood damage prevention, but it's not just their flood damage prevention ordinance that's required as part of the FEMA flood protection insurance program. And so what we could consider is, having districts set aside for recreational use, open spaces. We could consider in the case of flooding issues, a district overlay if we wanted to.
And that kind of falls in line with what's already been established with the scenic corridor overlay, the overlay of the historic district. So
right.
To me that lends itself, because we already have that established, that lends itself to create that a recreational overlay.
So I guess my question is, so we have a recreational district. Could you put a RV park in a recreational district that's in a floodway? That's my question, I assume. That's what I'm asking.
I think the floodway is going to trump everything. FEMA's going to dictate no matter what we say.
Well, as long as it's not permanent structures, you can.
Yeah.
FEMA.
So I want to try to bring this up, if I can get my mouse to cooperate with me. There it goes. So the city of North Richland Hills, Texas, and I'm not exactly familiar with where that is on the map. Fort Worth area, there we go. They use this overlay district model. And so here's the proposed language that they use. So the purpose and intent of a floodplain overlay district would be that it has been determined within the city of Martindale corporate limits that there exist flood hazard areas which are subject to periodic inundation and which can result in loss of life, property, and generally adversely affect the public health, safety, and general welfare. They establish the zoning district to minimize the potential adverse effects associated with those problems, and it delineates those areas that are subject to inundation by the regulatory 100-year flood, basically the FEMA flood maps. The boundary is set according with that FEMA flood hazard map, and it sets up, refers back to the flood damage prevention. So this would be like the preamble of a district overlay, and then we could include item D, E, or D's here, but E, F, G, if there's any land use restrictions that we'd want to place on top of that, in addition to our flood damage prevention regulation. So this would get to some of those issues that we have of technically right now, if somebody wanted to build a home within the floodway, they could. If they go through the engineering process, basically put the house on stilts and go through the engineering rigmarole that's required to comply with that regulation. If the city,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, they could. They could if it costs them a pretty penny to do it, but so far it's been cost prohibitive for most, not all.
That's what I was going to say. It's
so. However, there's been frequent discussions within this and previous councils regarding the building and land use within floodways. This would be a policy tool that you could consider to establish additional restrictions on that land use within those areas.
Okay.
Which goes, so this is one policy method. The other is to go through redistricting. Using open space, you could do both. But I wanted to tee this up for discussion, and I started with the letter A on art gallery to get here, but that's where we're at.
Comment.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like we're making this even more difficult by adding another layer. I think just going and redefining some of our definitions, such as, and adding to our table, such as adding an art gallery and campground or RV park. I don't know. This just kind of seems like we're going to have to do a lot more studying, and I get confused easily. So
it is confusing, Jan, and having gone through so much of this, a lot of years ago, if you feel like you're reinventing the wheel, but what I learned is that simple equals either liability or loopholes. And so if the council really wants a particular, look and feel, we have to put it out there, which takes some work.
Right. What this is trying to address is making decisions less focused on each individual application. Mm-hmm. It is, instead of addressing everything as an exception, and through specific use permits and applications for review, anybody who walks through the door could potentially have a different result. Is setting up here's the policy of the city when it comes to land use within these areas and define it, which would make the administration much easier on the staff and the city council to address questions and issues as they come forward. Really, this is about efficiencies. It's a policy change to achieve an efficiency in this land use area.
Are you looking to get this approved today, or can we talk?
Nope. These are thoughts and comments. It's similar to a workshop kind of setting. We're looking for feedback in the discussion forum on these ideas as I go through and then updating the regulation.
Hey, Jared, quick question for you, buddy.
Yeah.
I guess we could research other cities like San Marcos, New Braunfels. We could cut and paste and put it in this document. Also, we could see what kind of verbiage they use.
I looked at both of those at different times for different purposes. As I went through this, I would often Google a issue, followed by zoning, followed by Texas, and look at whatever city was there. And often went through and reviewed, I don't know, 15, 20 cities zoning ordinances, not word for word, but a large portion of each. New Braunfels was included. I don't know if San Marcos popped up on that. There are other cities in the area, Wimberley and the town that's adjacent to it. Bernie came up on that out in Kerrville, showed up at once or twice. And so some of those that are down here in this region. You also have the metroplexes in Houston and definitely up in Dallas Fort Worth, where there's just a sheer number of cities. You're going to have probably overrepresentation on Google of what their ordinances are. But when it comes to floodplain management, this was a unique feature that I hadn't found elsewhere. This idea of using a district overlay.
Because what I see and what I wanted to say is quite frankly, doing an overlay creates simplicity. Like, for example, our scenic corridor up and down Highway 80. Well, there are several different zones within that. And so it applies to all of them in that particular location. But the other thing that I like, the way that you've laid this out, Jared, is that we can say, for example, we have a difference between the floodway and the floodplain. And so say there's a property in the overlay district and it has both, it's partly in the floodway and partly in the floodplain. So we could determine, differences as far as what we would want and or allow to see in that area by definition, which I think is good.
Any other comments or thoughts as we get into this issue of a district overlay or open space zoning districts and those things?
I like it.
I need to study it more.
Yeah, the what it's getting at, it's almost going forward. You're going backward to go forward. Is a zone, as a land use table that's a little bit more like what it used, or at least was preliminary proposed in 1997, based on the extensive study that they did at that time.
So instead of using the floodway or the floodplain, it would just be in the flood overlay?
What it would do, it would be both. So I would suggest we use the flood overlay district, has the same boundaries as a 100-year floodplain. And then instead, often the comments I've heard in city council meetings are, we don't want somebody building houses regardless if it meets the engineering standards for those areas. If we wanted to do that, the floodplain or flood damage prevention regulations would not prevent somebody from building a house in that area. They would just have to meet, for some, a cost prohibitive standard of engineering to do so.
Mhm.
This would provide the ability for city council to say, regardless of whether it's feasible to do it through engineering and the rest, it ain't happening. That's not a permitted land use within our city in those areas.
And let me chime in and give a real live example that I personally am grateful didn't happen, but was brought to me, and I walked with this property owner and looked at the area. The gentleman who purchased the property down on Northwest River Road across from Jack Mudd and then developed it, Gordon, I can't remember, Campbell is his name. One of the first things that he let me know was that he owned property on the coast. So he had done some developments with basically beach houses. And so we all know a beach house to be on stilts, you park underneath, and the house is up high. So that was what he was originally looking at doing. Somewhere, whether it was where he was or upstream some or downstream some, he wanted to, he thought, well, can I just build houses on stilts? You know, and the way that our ordinance and the way that our restrictions are listed, yeah, he could. And like Jared said, it became it quickly was understood that, tide coming in and beach water, unless it's a hurricane, is different than the San Marcos River with a 40-foot wall of water. So he chose not to do that. But I would have liked to have been able to said, you know what, if you're in the flood plain, it doesn't matter. Even if you get 24 inches above base flood elevation, the city does not permit any houses over X amount of height. So it would have just eliminated a lot of question, because he actually did some engineering plans and spent a few $1,000s trying to see if that was going to be feasible.
And so you mentioned the overlay in certain areas, say the floodplain or the floodway, would restrict development because of the overlay, regardless if it's in the floodway or the floodplain?
The city count, by having a district overlay, you create land use restrictions and regulations within that district overlay. As an example, we have a couple now. The scenic corridor, while the C1 is highlighted here in green, I'm going to try to zoom in. There's also a dotted line that follows that same line, and that's our scenic corridor. Mm-hmm. And it goes from end to end. That scenic corridor prevents certain land uses, if you will, it establishes standards for development in that region. So like we had the other night, somebody within the Skyview section of town had to come in and get a certificate of appropriateness for a house they wanted to build because it fell within that scenic overlay. And that because there's a restriction on that. So what this would do is, in a similar fashion, it would cut across different land use zoning districts, C1, R1, R2, R3, the whole shebang. And you'd say, in this flood district, you cannot do X, Y, or Z, or you must do X, Y, or Z, or these are what's permitted, this is what's not permitted. And that's for city council to consider. Based on previous discussions, I understand it to be that the sense of council has been, we don't want any development. We don't want houses on stilts. We want that to be open space, non-developed areas. And so through a district overlay, you can achieve that, or you can go through and carve out separate districts for that open space and have a map that looks more similar to this, that carves it out. Or you could leave your map looking similar, but with an overlay district that achieves a similar effect.
And correct me if I'm wrong. So the way that we have the scenic corridor, which is an overlay, as well as the historic district, which is considered an overlay, it's not a zone. It just so happens, by the nature of our city and the configuration of the areas, those overlays are all together, like contiguous to each, all over a like Highway 80. It's all the way down Highway 80 when we developed it, 300 feet on both sides, easy, done and done. What I'm seeing, so this is what I'm kind of my question. What I'm seeing is that if we have a floodway overlay or a flood district, it may be in 5 different areas, not touching each other within the city limits. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and that's okay.
So similar here, you have the historic district, and there's within the historic district that's outlined by this brown dotted line, you have a smattering of R1 and then a lot of mixed use.
Right.
So you'd have a similar dotted line going along the river and along the creeks.
Right.
As Lisa mentioned, some people that have larger pieces of land within the city limits of Martindale have land that is permitted to build on in the floodway and in the floodplain. So if you have some land that's say in the 100-year floodplain that can be built on with certain FEMA restrictions, you're now saying that you might have a flood overlay saying that those people in the floodplain then could not build at all.
If that's the degree in which we wanted to regulate development within that area. I'm saying that in previous council meetings, when this issue came up, specifically down near Allen Bates Park and along the river in this area, there was a sense that I had that council would not approve or would not wish to have development done in that region.
But what if the piece of land has land that also within that same piece of land has land that can be built on? Then you would be able to allow that because it's not in the floodway or the floodplain.
The districting would not necessarily follow, in this case, would not follow the property boundary lines. Right. It would follow the floodplain lines. So it would look squiggly all through here. And so likely almost assuredly, there would be plots of land, properties within the city that would have portions of it within that floodplain district and portions of it that were not.
Because I have that example specifically.
Yeah, so if your plot of land, let's use a big one right here with this 27, whatever this is, say this big plot of land, you could theoretically, I don't have the flood map in front of me, but if the flood map said, all right, this portion now, below the line is in the floodway, you have that restricted land use in that section. But if it's above the line, then you're okay because of the elevation and you don't have any restriction.
And just to reiterate,
it simplifies the administration of the floodplain ordinance.
Yeah.
The flood damage prevention ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
When we're speaking with developers and the rest.
I don't know. If I was a property owner, I'm just, in the floodway or floodplain, I'm not sure I'd like working with too many restrictions.
That's kind of the
there's a lot of
kind of the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We already have restrictions with FEMA, and then if they want something that is, requires a variance, it becomes subject to the council at the time and whatever their temperament is.
Right. What we're trying to do is not have, ruling by exception where you're reviewing application after application after application without a standard criteria in which you're either evaluating it or approving it, other than the subjective view of that council at that time. It makes a lot more sense to me to establish a policy that would apply to every scenario and which would help give the city the city staff especially, and Lisa in her role as the chair of the planning committee and zoning commission, getting these requests from developers and inquiries from developers. You would have a lot of this, yes, if you get the application approved. As an example, we had that area that we discussed earlier tonight in the planning and zoning commission meeting. If those areas were identified as open space and you can't use them, and it said, no development at all, and someone came in and said, oh, I want to do this. If we had clearly defined regulations that were regarding that use, we wouldn't have to go through the application procedures. We would just say, in the regulation, it says no. You know, and then they could go through the Board of Adjustment and Appeals and that whole process, but it would provide clarity up front when we're dealing with inquiries.
That's a good point. That's a good point, Jared. That's a good point.
It's going to be hard pressed though for some of these larger landowners for you to really restrict them to say that you can only have open space there. Eventually they'll have inabilities to pay their property tax unless they can get some kind of ag exemption or open space exemption. Because if you're saying if I have some land in the floodplain and I can't build anything on it, and yet I'm paying $10,000 a year in taxes, how is the person going to be able to afford to pay their property taxes if you're putting another level of such a stringent building requirements?
Jared, can I make a point real quick?
Sure.
Maybe this overlay should be only in the floodway. Maybe
It could be that as well.
that might be what Sam's concern is. If it's in a floodway, therefore FEMA is very strict on that also. So that would probably, because there's a lot of areas there in the floodplain, you know, that there's areas on the floodplain, as we know, for example, Summer Breeze, you know, but then there's areas in the floodway, you know, so maybe this overlay should be considered in the floodway only.
And by definition, and I think the mayor may weigh in on this, what exactly can you do according to FEMA in the floodway?
It restricts you, our ordinance restricts us from doing any kind of fill, construction, anything that could impede the water flow, unless you have a signed professional engineering
Correct.
hydrology study that says that whatever you're planning on putting in there does not impede the water flow either upstream or in the nearby area.
Could you have a house on stilts that would be 24, its finished floor would be 24 inches above BFE in the floodway?
It could happen.
Okay.
I mean, when people talk about you can't build a structure, the river's going to knock it down. You know, the 1979 bridge has been through all of that. I mean, it's got to be built with that kind of.
So that would be an example, Mike. You know, if in fact the council said, you know, based on the way that our river is, in a way that the current buildings and houses are located, it really doesn't fit the look and the feel of our city to have literally a house that is, you know, on stilts that would be, you know, 1.5 stories before you even hit the finished floor. So if in fact the council decided that really doesn't fit there, even though legally, according to what FEMA says, as long as they meet all the requirements, they could, we as a city could say with a flood overlay in the floodway, we're not going to permit that kind of structure.
Lisa, let me add a real quick point to add to Mr. DeVinny's point. This river is unique, and like I said, like he said, if you have it on stilts like a bridge, you know, we got cypress trees, you know, 12 feet in diameter, and you could literally knock a house down. You know, I mean, a stilt house maybe in a flood plain would be advisable, but if you're in a floodway, that's a whole nother. For example, I don't know what the latest with the San Marcos River Ranch, you know, those plots that we approved, last year sometime, you know, the ones from the
about 3 years ago.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
For some reason, I walk there all the time. They have not developed those. So I don't know what's going on, but there could be some issues basically because of the new floodplain maps, because those particular properties are now in the floodway. Mm-hmm. Those ones right there. And also those people over there are building these slabs 4 feet off the ground. and they're a lot of that property used to be in the flood plain.
Right.
So that, I think that change of the floodplain maps really made a huge difference. So that's why I said, I mean, to be fair, I think with Sam, that if we do this overlay, it should be the floodway only, I would say. That's my personal.
Yeah, I agree with that. You can do all kinds of things in the floodplain.
Correct. Okay.
So I think you
Dan or Sonia, any other thoughts on this issue of open spaces and floodplain districts?
I think that with this, as they were saying, FEMA already has so many restrictions as it is. I kind of like the idea in the floodplain, like you said, it would be a squiggly line, on there to have open spaces. I mean, like whenever I see like New Braunfels and you see the houses on the stilts right there beside the river, and when you're going over the bridge, and then that's like what you see, and that's permitted there. I think, whenever I'm hearing talk like that, that's what I envision.
That could happen.
Uh-huh.
I mean, because right now that area is zoned residential. It's at least on that lower part of the river, and actually all the way up, it's zoned residential. So you could have somebody build closer to the river or in those currently undeveloped areas, as long as they met the FEMA guidelines and standards, engineering standards. But by right, they could do it.
Yeah.
Hey, Jared, you might want to Google this. I think Rob's been here long enough. I know I have. There's a picture of a house floating away in New Braunfels on the Guadalupe River. It was on stilts, and the river rose, and the house literally floated away, came off its piers.
There was a house that floated away just on the
Wimberley.
downtown, no, just on the downtown side of the triangle. If you guys remember back in the flood of 98, I was here, and right now, when you're standing at the triangle, if you look up on the left, you'll see a house that's on stilts. There used to be a house on stilts in that lower bowl area below the house that's one there currently. And literally in the flood of 98, that house lifted up off the stilts and left, floated down.
And see, I mean, so then like what I'm hearing, I like it because it gives the city, able to say, whenever we're talking about houses on stilts and on the side of the riverbed, don't we need trees on the side of the river to make our river flourish and protect our rivers? Don't we need our plants, the plants and the, everything that grows there on the side of the river to sustain our river life? Like, I think it just adds another measure, of protection to protect the river.
Right. I agree. That's why I wanted to bring this up for consideration.
And one more point. I want to make one more point. I'm finished. And you got to remember the flood of 15 when that poor family perished in the flood on the Blanco, and the whole house came off the piers, and the poor woman was calling from her cell phone if she was flowed down to her death. That was so tragic. So I'll end with that.
Dan, any comments on this issue?
Not at this time.
Okay. All right. So I'll start drafting up some language regarding potential restrictions based on tonight's conversation on this. And then we can discuss the floodplain for floodway and some of those items. And then we'll bring it back up for discussion the next time. So we started with an art gallery. This is how we get here, but this is how zoning kind of works. You start looking at things and you want to maintain consistency. I'm going to move on from the art gallery issue and definition and start getting into some of these others that I think are important to consider, being aware of time, because we're now getting to 8:30. We didn't define a bar or a tavern in our use tables. So the definition I pulled was a commercial establishment under a license from the Texas Alcohol and Beverage Commission, which is principally engaged in the retail sale of alcoholic beverages, with food only incidental to the sale of alcohol, as a definition for a bar or tavern. Now this becomes important when we're considering development, possibly downtown or our commercial spaces, because I'm trying to get to our use table, I believe there are restrictions on that. So that definition, we ran into this some, as you've noticed, through the governor's orders when it came to COVID restrictions, setting up different standards between a restaurant and a bar or tavern. The city may want to consider doing similarly for its commercial use.
But now, isn't it because of COVID that certain bars are able to stay open because they are selling now more than 50% of their revenue in food and not in alcohol? So that would counteract that, because many of the bars now are staying open because they are selling more food.
Well, in that case, they're acting more as a restaurant, and would that really be an issue? The other thing to consider when it comes to bars or taverns is this is similar to, as we discussed, there is no permitted use of a bar or tavern within the city of Martindale.
Mm-hmm.
Each item, each of the zoning have specific use. And so that means depending on the timing and the orientation of the city council would approve or disapprove that specific use without setting criteria or standards regarding that approval. So if I could, I'd like to challenge us to describe the criteria or the regulation of a bar or tavern. It doesn't make sense to have it as a permitted use and then say maybe. It either, I think for, at least in some zone, either should be allowed or should not be allowed.
Mm-hmm.
With some, I don't understand what criteria I would use as a zoning administrator to make recommendations to the commission on whether to approve an application for a bar or tavern. And that makes it difficult for the city staff to perform their duties. And so that we can get clarity in the regulation on this item, it would be helpful.
So what I'm hearing you say is that we have it defined. We have bar and tavern defined in our definitions. But
I'm proposing a definition. We don't have it defined even today.
Oh, we
today we don't have we don't define what a bar or tavern is. And then we don't say what.
And it's not in the table?
In our use table, it's just a special use permit for mixed use in C1 districts.
Okay, so we need for you to present us with the definition that we could then add to the ordinance.
And
so yeah, that's here. So it's establishment essentially that's licensed as principally engaged in the retail sale of alcoholic beverages with food only incidental to the sale of alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody know, Kent, you may know, does TABC is there a different license that an establishment is given when their 51% of their sales are food versus when they're not and they serve alcohol? Is it a different alcohol license? Anybody know?
I don't know.
I know it's based off of the nature of the drinks. I know that beer and wine is different from mixed drinks licensing. I'm not aware of a determination in terms of license of being called a bar or a tavern. That's something that really came out of this COVID-19 response.
I think that is by ordinance. And if I remember correctly, when the city voted to allow beer and wine or spirits be sold in the city limits, if I remember correctly, when that was passed, there was something that indicated you had to have 51% of your revenue from food. That may be something to do a little homework on.
It's not a codified regulation. So
okay.
Yes, it was an ordinance that was passed some time ago. That regulation has not been codified in our code. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's.
Is that something you've been able to put your hands on?
That's a question that we've been kicking around with Kent for quite some time, how we handle ordinances that are not codified.
I mean, I remember voting on that. That the council at that time, which would have been back in like 09 or 10 timeframe, we did not want, and I'm speaking for, the others as well. We didn't want every building downtown or anywhere to be just a bar. We wanted to maintain a little bit of that family atmosphere, but yet still give the opportunity to have a bar within. So I'd be interested if we could find those documents and bring them back up to this council. Things are certainly different, no doubt.
Yeah.
I'll take that one for action.
I think the history of the S's, in fact, is there really only one S, or both of those currently in there?
Both of them are currently in there.
Yeah, was probably, it was a big jump for the city of Martindale to allow alcohol sales inside the city limits. There was
Yes, it was.
some old documents from the Martindales that restricted that, and they had to jump through that hoop. And my guess is that when they put this into the use table, it was there may be some legal things that keep us from restricting it altogether. I can't weigh in on that, but this was to make sure that if they were going to have just a bar, they had to come and ask and explain what was going on.
Correct. That's
so although it seems a little screwy, that was the control to go do that. As far as I'm concerned, striking that whole row out, it doesn't hurt my feelings a bit. I mean, we don't need a bunch of bars around here in town. But.
So a couple questions that were raised are there different licensing for the an establishment in terms of like 51% alcoholic beverages versus less? Is there, in terms of TABC, do you know off the top of your head whether that has a different licensing from a bar to a restaurant?
Or
my work in that area is not extensive enough for me to tell you. I don't. My answer is about like yours. There are different kinds of licenses based on what kind of alcohol you want to sell, but I'm not certain of the limits.
Okay, and then on the bar or tavern specific use permit, would there be a legal consideration that we'd have to consider through an application that's requiring that specific use permit?
Such as?
Look at the food and beverage certificate.
They'd have to have their license.
That's what you can get from the TABC.
Okay.
And it's more of a restaurant than it is a bar.
Okay.
Repeat that.
So what Dwayne is telling me in my ear is that TABC has a food and beverage certificate that is different in scope that would be typically associated from a bar or a tavern.
So I think the 51%, I think that is by city ordinance. If a city wants to require that, that's what it is. But what you're saying is that we don't have it. It never was signed, or it never was just submitted to be codified.
I do not. It appears that it was not submitted to be codified as part of our code of ordinances.
Okay. Well,
Can you talk about American Legal Publishing?
There are probably, I don't know, 100 ordinances that were passed in the history of this city that have not been codified. Maybe 200.
When you say that, are you saying that they were not updated on American Legal Publishing, or is there some other form you're talking about?
No, they were not. They were not sent to American Legal Publishing during the initial codification process. I think it was 2011, 9, somewhere in there. And have not been added since.
But they are still legal. They were passed by the council.
Yeah, and there's some confusion on whether that ordinance, whether the adopting ordinance of the code would just would in some way take out those previous ordinances that were passed prior to the codification. So section 3 of that ordinance that was passed 2012. All ordinances and resolutions or parts of ordinances or resolutions in conflict with this ordinance are repealed. This repeal does not extend to city ordinances of a general and ongoing nature that are not included in the coordinate ordinances, including without limitation the following ordinance, all of which are expressly saved from repeal. So the only one that was not expressly saved from repeal was the animal control ordinance, which now calls into question whether ordinances not codified as part of ordinance 2012-0201 would continue to exist or not. It leaves it open to interpretation, I think.
I say if the city council voted and approved an ordinance, that it is effective whether staff submitted it to American Legal to be, quote, codified or not. It just creates additional confusion as to what the rules are. But it's, in my opinion, if it was passed, it was passed.
Yeah, but if you can't look it up to check on it and make sure that we're doing it right, then
it's still there. It just means
that. Okay, so we're just going to take your word for it, even though we can't find the ordinance.
If we want to go back and pull the ordinances and send them all to American Legal, we're probably looking at $10,000 to $20,000.
No. This one that you're looking at that's on the screen right now, section 3, I think that was the big eraser, right? That was in 2012. They said, okay, here's all the real laws that we're going to go forward.
Okay.
And there they are. And everything else before this, all those old ones that, have outdated themselves, that's the big eraser. It just says they're gone. So
I agree with that.
Okay.
I think the statement I was making was things that we have passed after 2012, that because of financial constraints or because they just, it wasn't in the budget to spend $10,000 this year to send all of these ordinances that we passed to American Legal to be, quote, codified, they didn't happen. So I'm specifically talking about after 2012.
There may be some of those, but not very many, I don't believe. But yeah. So Kent, if you could weigh on this section 3 and as it applies to this discussion of whether a previously passed ordinance regarding alcohol sales within the city, if it predates this 2012 ordinance that adopted this codes, is it struck from, I guess, our
if there was a pre-2012 ordinance that dealt with alcohol sales, then a 2012 ordinance relating to alcohol sales would repeal and replace that previous ordinance.
So if we have not passed a new ordinance since 2012, then that pre-2012 ordinance still is in effect.
Yes.
Okay.
Even with why you read section 3.
All ordinances and resolutions or parts of ordinances or resolutions in conflict with this ordinance are repealed. So you would have to show that a pre-2012 ordinance or resolution was in conflict with what was passed in 2012.
And if there's no conflict, it's still in effect.
Correct.
Okay.
So the point's taken. I'll go look to try to find. We'll try to find that alcohol ordinance and bring it back because I think that may have some bearing on this zoning discussion.
Yeah, I think the problem we're going to have is can anyone establish that 12-foot in diameter cypress tree on Mike's property actually fell? In other words, it comes back to the old idea, if a tree falls and no one hears it.
Stop.
Right. Okay. Moving on. So boarding house. We had a definition of boarding houses, I tried to create some clarity with the advent of short-term rentals where you may have rooms being rented out individually on a room by room basis, and as a short-term rental. And so to create some clarity, putting here that a boarding house provides housing for greater than 30 days, essentially. I can read the whole definition if it's helpful.
What's your question?
Just letting you know that I made this change, and if there's any comments on it.
Okay.
We're just going to keep rolling if not. We had defined in our use table a caretaker or guard residence as a permitted use in certain zones, but without defining it. So I pulled this definition of a caretaker or guard residence as a single attached or detached dwelling unit intended for a caretaker, owner, operator, manager, or watchman that is that person's immediate family or for any commercial or industrial use for the purposes of security and protection of the principal use, manufactured, modular, or industrial homes are specifically prohibited for the use as a caretaker residence. So a good example of this is drawing on our discussion of a RV park. If we wanted an on-site manager 24/7 that lived there and operated that RV park, that residence would be considered a caretaker or a guard residence. You might have this also with, open storage of equipment or different things.
I don't know if it should be limited to the person's immediate family. That you're saying it would just have to be someone within the family that owns the land can only be considered a caretaker, and not someone that the family or the business would hire outside of a family member?
No, it's that person's performing that caretaking, that person's immediate family. So, like a parsonage with a church or something, if there's a house associated with a church, only that pastor or clergy person and that person's immediate family would be allowed in the residence. In this case, if you had a junkyard and a mobile home on it, the only people staying in that mobile home are that person's immediate family. It's not a boarding house, if you will.
But it could be somebody you hired, right?
The person that you hired, it's almost as it's like an additional benefit that a company might provide.
But you're saying the person that would be hired as a caretaker can only be within the immediate family?
So only that caretaker that's hired, only that person's immediate family is able to use that as their residence.
So in other words,
The caretaker. I see. Okay.
So what about the church that's right there in the corner? You know how they have that house, but then like people come and stay there, but it belongs to the church, but the people that come stay there, from my understanding, was snowbirds.
Yeah, so that one we have a different definition of it. It is the definition of a parsonage.
Gotcha.
And so we'd handle it. I was trying to figure out another way to describe a similar effect of ancillary to your duties. You're provided a residence, a dwelling to stay in. And the only people who are allowed in that dwelling would be your immediate family.
But actually, who do we have in town that would go check that? Who's gonna keep up with that and go say, are you a part of their immediate family? I mean, like, who's really gonna enforce that?
So where this could become important is in the case of an RV park. If there was a dwelling set up for that caretaker of that RV park, and they started renting it out as a unregulated short-term rental, then we would go and enforce not only a short-term rental thing, but we'd also enforce that residence is not serving its permitted use. There would be a code enforcement issue. Right now, all of our code enforcement is done mainly by our police force.
We're not getting people from the county? Don't you have to be certified?
No, our building inspectors are certified, but and they enforce building codes, but not in land use codes.
Jan, you must be, if you want to refer to yourself as a code enforcement officer, you must be licensed under the occupations code. However, a city needn't hire someone that is qualified as a code enforcement officer under the occupations code to enforce its ordinances.
Okay.
But we currently have police that try to enforce codes, such as building codes,
Ordinances.
By
Yeah,
default,
we're enforcing ordinances at that point.
it's by
Ideally, if we had a larger budget, we would have a full-time code enforcement officer separate from our police force.
And we had one years ago and it was not good. But that's irrelevant. Sorry.
Yes.
All right. Any other discussion on this issue? Okay. Campground. So here we go. This is going to get us into another. This will bring us, I think, to a close, and we can pick up after as it's getting late. Campground definition here: a place with designated campsite spaces, established, maintained, and provided for temporary occupancy, not lasting more than 9 consecutive nights, by patrons camping with tents or recreational vehicles less than 20 feet in length on a temporary basis for recreation, education, or vacation purposes. Campgrounds shall provide the following minimum amenities: permanent charcoal grills for each campsite, a potable water supply, toilet and bathing facilities for men and women, and an on-site camp manager, a single caretaker/guard residence dwelling, and a kiosk, which is defined elsewhere, are permitted accessory uses.
I like it.
Also, in our use table, if we adopt a recreational zone, that would allow us, a recreational zoning district, that would allow us to have a permitted use for campgrounds. That way, when we have an issue of, hey, I want to establish a campground, the location where it is permitted by right is within recreational areas. That way, not everybody who wants that sort of campground has to come in and ask for permission. It'd only have to do so if it were in C1, as it were. You'll notice I've made a carve out for recreational vehicle parks. These, in our use table, we have additional conditions identified following the table. Here I've added some regarding the campground, and I figured that would be a good, we can start with a campground, define what a campground is, and then use that structure as a place of departure of how we want to establish recreational vehicle park regulations. Everybody with me so far?
Well, some of the areas you can find as a recreational overlay in some of the floodplains or the floodways are also zoned as either R1 or R2. So you wouldn't allow campgrounds in R1 or R2 in the recreational overlay areas. You're just allowing it in commercial.
So so this is where we have a decision to make on that overlay. We could do both. We could have the floodplain overlay, floodplain district overlay, and we could also set up our own recreational and open space districts, similar to what was proposed in 1997. And so in that scenario, these dark green shaded areas, those are open space, ostensibly recreational use areas. What I would consider using these as recreational areas. And so campgrounds would be permitted in this dark green. So in our comprehensive plan, unfortunately, this is one of the tables or maps I was unable to scan and download. It did have a section regarding existing and future park systems, and a description of recreational open space in their study that they did. And I'm just going to hold up the book so no one can see it online. But in this book, it describes the triangle area. I want to try to zoom in here. The triangle area identified here in this green, this lower portion from 1979, below 1979, and the triangle that exists with Southeast River Road in 1979. Those areas were identified for existing and future park systems. And so as a starting point for discussion, I'd use that as an area where we want to consider a recreational use district in which campgrounds, and as I mentioned earlier, museums potentially, although it would not apply where there's a flood overlay district, campgrounds would be a permitted use in that section.
Okay.
Jared, I got a quick question. Now, there could be some safety concerns if people were camping and we had a flood event. That's
a great segue, Mike. I can tee you up, Eddie. That's a great segue. So as I mentioned, there's additional restrictions that we can place on those, and I think Sonia found a really good example. She brought it in tonight on hard copy. I'm going to look at it further. But I use another example that I pulled from a county in North Carolina, as it turned out. They had one that I really thought was laid out nicely, where they established campground design standards. And so I borrowed heavily from that design standard, and we can go through each of those, and it describes, space size, lot sizes, the density that would be created. And we can go, one of the items tucked in here is that if you're in a floodway, you would have to provide as part of your application or something, you would have to provide a safety plan that addresses flood emergency requirements and how folks would be handled and property would be protected and those sort of things.
And would that be subject to council's approval, or if they provided the emergency plan because of their requirement, it would be accepted? I mean, if they meet the requirements of the emergency plan, obviously we're not just going to say, call 911 or something.
They should have an evacuation plan.
Correct.
Jared.
So here's where that language is described. I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit so you might
please.
click.
Thank you.
All spaces shall be located on sites with elevations that are not susceptible to flooding unless the campground receives approval from the flood administrator and city council based on an application submitted by the property owner. The application for approval of a campground within a floodplain or floodway shall include a plan to monitor flood forecasting conditions, effectuate an orderly evacuation of habitants, and limit damage to property and the environment in the case of a flood. All development must comply with the flood damage prevention ordinance.
We don't have a flood administrator, correct?
That's me. That's one of my many hats.
So if we have any floodplain questions, we would ask you, and then you would do the research?
Yes.
Okay.
But our ordinances, as an aside, our ordinances set up a lot of, if this is not identified, it defaults to somebody else. There's probably 6 different positions I have because of that. And then those days that I'm not here, those defer back to the mayor. So all of those who are interested in running for mayor, you can be the floodplain administrator, the building official, the zoning administrator, the records management officer. You can be all sorts of things if you want to be. So in this case, yes, as it's currently staffed, it would default to me.
Okay.
I have a question for Mike.
Go ahead, Jan.
Mike, there's several campgrounds on the river. Usually they're canoe facilities. you know, like Spencer's and Goins. Do they have some kind of evacuation plan?
I would imagine the owners probably are watching the flood gauges. As something comes up, they notify them immediately to get out. So fortunately, we usually have time before it hits us,
Right,
you know.
right. Okay, just curious. All right, go ahead, Sam. I'm sorry.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Is this the same thing as on the RV line? I look like you referenced the same.
Yeah, so what I, instead of writing both the campground regulation and the RV park regulation, I figured what we could do is start with the campground, define that, and identify areas where we'd want to make changes. Because there's probably a lot that would go from one to the next. And so I don't want to have to make changes on
Quick point.
areas.
I am a little bothered by on the campground is the way it read, or I understood it sounded like a commercial operation, right? You're gonna rent out spaces, gonna have bathrooms, everybody's gonna do
Yeah.
that.
Right.
But the overlay says that if it's in an R1 and the overlay goes over it, does that mean that because you put it under the RE thing, all of a sudden you rezoned those?
Yeah, it would be a rezoning of those R1.
Rezoning or just an overlay? An overlay is not a rezone.
My recommendation is that we, in addition to a floodplain district overlay, we'd also consider a recreational zoning district and rezone portions of R1 into that recreational zoning district.
And by looking at the map with what you have, what you're going to be recommending, are those areas spotty here and there, or are they sort of all in the same area with similar use around them?
It would basically be anywhere east and south of Allen Bates Park.
And I totally agree with that, because like we've run into the wall before of people who are considering either building or purchasing property in that area, and their first question is, what can I do? It says R1, but yet the flood part won't let you build it unless I spend a gazillion dollars. So I'm on board with what you're talking about in that area. Yes.
Jared, quick point.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be a designation separating campgrounds from an RV park. For example,
I agree.
If you're camping, if you're camping, one thing, and you're in a flash flood occurs, you can get out quickly. Whereas an RV park, somebody could have left their RV there or blah blah blah, and then the thing gets swept, or they're in their camper and they get swept or whatever. So there should be definitely two distinct categories separating the two.
Right. So
That's what we're working on.
so here's the definition of campground. I want to try to fit both of them in there because I think it'll be valuable for the discussion. Let's see if I can get that to work. Now we'll have to go find RV. All right. Unfortunately, some of this is hidden from me. So the initial statement, a place designated for campsite spaces is a campground. A place designated with recreational vehicle or campsite spaces, both established for temporary occupancy. The campground is limited to 9 consecutive nights, basically a weekend on each end of a work week. And then the RV park would be limited to not lasting more than 30 consecutive nights as a difference. For the same basis of recreation and vacation. RV park would have additional amenities. So like where a campground has minimal amenities for charcoal grills, a potable water supply, toilet bathing facilities, and an on-site camp manager, a RV park would have the same portable or charcoal grills, potable water supply, but would also have electric supply and wastewater hookups for each campsite. Toilet and bathing facilities are the same. A minimum of one recreational activity facility, such as a pool or outdoor sports facility, and a minimum of one retail facility and an on-site park manager. So what it's establishing there is an RV park is a lot more developed. You have to provide electric supply and wastewater hookups for each campsite. That could be pretty stringent. That's something that we can consider removing, but I figured I'd start there for discussion. And it would also provide additional facilities such as a pool and a camp store.
So let me just throw in there when you talk about wastewater. So for example, the way our ordinance reads is that for any new development, if your property is within 300 feet of our current wastewater lines, then you are required by ordinance to hook up. However, using the example that we spoke about in the P&Z meeting tonight, that particular property, that entire area is not connected to wastewater, and that specific property is not 300 feet or less in location to our wastewater. So based on what I'm hearing in this is that despite all of what I've just said, they would still have to connect to wastewater instead of septic.
Potentially.
That's
a term that we'd have to define. I think I was writing this section about 1:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
1:20 in the morning. So I went with a term that I knew best, and I chose the term wastewater. But it could be pumping station or whatever you want to call it.
Sewer, just sewer. That sort of, or it could. Go ahead.
Sorry, Lisa. I think that it also has to have the size of the land per RV.
Right.
And then also it needs to have the roads coming in and out. You need the size for vehicles, potentially having gooseneck trailers. You need to have I would say, like, I think what I've read is most places have a 20-foot wide road to be able to go around. And so I think all that needs to be defined in there as well.
I agree. So there are standards, design standards I put in here for campgrounds that could be expanded upon and changed for the RV park. But I wanted to first make sure I was on the right track.
Yeah.
Jared, quick question.
Yeah.
The way this is written is, say somebody wanted to put a RV park in a floodway, they would have a problem because they could not build a shop, a retail shop, or a swimming pool, or blah, blah, blah. You follow what I'm saying? They'd have an issue.
If you say, if the flood district overlay regulation was that no development could take place on that land, no structures could be built, then a requirement to build a structure for an RV park would not RV park would not be permitted, therefore,
Gotcha.
within the flood district.
Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. Appreciate it.
One thing that I want to throw in there, when you were talking about the amount of days in a campground, no more than 9 days, there are RV parks or RV resorts where people go to winter, they snowbirds, and they're there for 5 months. I personally had an opportunity to visit with someone who, in this particular park, they were required, and I don't think this was in a city limit, so it must have been the requirement of the actual RV park or resort. Anybody that was there, quote, long term, they were required to move to a different space within the park like every 3 weeks.
This would set it up that they'd have to move every 30 days.
Okay. And so they can still be in the park, they just have to go to a different site.
Yes, that would be a workaround, and whether we wanted to permit that activity or not is something that we should consider in crafting this language.
Here's what that prevents. Here's what that prevents that I personally like. It prevents someone who is there for an extended period of time, 3 to 6 months. It prevents them from building a deck around their recreational vehicle. It prevents them from putting up a fence. It prevents them from looking like they live there long term. And that creates a very different feel when you drive in and around RV parks. It's very easy to figure out, oh, these people are here for eternity versus they are vacationing.
Jan, you had something?
I was just, I don't mind, snowbirds coming for a while.
Not at all.
So.
Yeah, I had a question.
This is different than, a place where you can rent vehicles or rent a space. I mean, well, I guess it is. I don't know. But
that's something that we'd want to consider within the special.
Yeah, that needs to be defined separately.
Yeah, it would be defined separate from the definition,
right?
If you will.
I had a question about your recreational overlay over the R1 sections. Could we go back to the zoning map?
So it wouldn't be an overlay, it'd be a full-blown redistricting of the zone.
Okay, could we look at that R1 around 1979, that zone, I mean the zoning, like so how many areas of R2 could you scoot the R2 up a little more so we can see the whole section? See, R2 is manufactured, but you can see that with my piece of land that's zoned R2, it could also be considered a recreational zone because it is on the river frontage, but it is the only piece of land that is zoned R2 that also has river frontage. If there's other areas of town that are zoned R2, because if it being R2, of course it's zoned manufactured homes, but I can't have manufactured homes in the floodway. So if I have recreational land that's zoned R2, but you're saying you're only permitting the recreational overlay in R1, then why can't river frontage properties?
It wouldn't be only. Is an easy way to define in shorthand the region within the city that we'd want to do this. Well, it could be anywhere from the intersection and south to Southeast River Road. We could make all of this R2 recreational if we wanted to. We can make all of R1. We can, if we're going to go through the rezoning, redistricting those zones, we can make it what we want it to be.
Okay, well, I'm just saying those areas that you would deem recreational, but if it's also zoned, because how many other areas of town that are zoned R2 have river frontage? Are there any other areas?
I don't believe there is, and if there is, it wouldn't necessarily be germane to the idea of where we would want to put this new recreational use district. What we'd essentially do is we'd take a box. Let's see if I can draw a box. We'd take a box and say everything within that box, oh, that didn't stick. Everything within this box is now a recreational.
No longer R1, it's no longer R2, it's RE.
No longer, it's now RE. Instead of R2, R1, all that's gone, it's now RE.
And
it'd be a new color. It would be green. Instead of pink and yellow, you'd have a green space over these properties.
And obviously you would take into account what the current zone is, and it would be reflected on the use table that a single family dwelling detached would still be permitted in that new zone, correct?
No, they would not. They would be a permitted non-conforming use, which is a fancy way of saying they can continue doing it if it was there, but it can't be done any further from there.
Okay, so what that means, what I hear you say is that for example, and maybe we're talking about a specific area where this does not exist, so please strike it if it doesn't. But what that says is that if there is a single family detached dwelling in an area that we then change to RE or recreational, whatever you said it was, then if that house burned down, that family would not be permitted to rebuild a new house. That would be single family detached.
If it was the same own, there's a whole bunch of laws regarding continuing non-permitted uses and such, and we'll get real smart on that if that happened. But
so the way that
it's a potential effect, yes. So you would have these areas here if you come on.
The way that we dealt with that in the past, for example, there were some mobile homes inside of, like, Martindale proper, for example. There was a mobile home on the corner of Bowie and Johnson Street when we did this, when we, did the rezoning back in 09 and 10 and such. And the ordinance states that those non-conforming dwellings could remain there. But if in fact it were ever, if it ever burned, or if the family wanted to upgrade and get a new one, if it was taken off the property, nothing of its like could be put back on that property.
Yes, and that could, if we extended the RE zone from Allen Bakes Park across 1979, south to southeast of River Road, those areas, those properties that may have a dwelling on that zone in R2 would fall within that same rule set of, if they wanted to tear down their house and build a new one, they wouldn't be allowed to.
Yeah, I think we should look at that in totality and really look and see how many parcels and folks we would be affecting in that area.
And we could do a simple thing of not redistricting that property ID.
As long as
depending as, if it's still connected to the rest of its zoning, whatever property ID this is right here, if that has a house on it, well, then you redistrict around it.
Jag around it, yeah.
No, there was a house there, but that's where the Cochran property was that ran all along Owl Hollow there. But yeah, I would hate to see my whole piece of land be turned into a recreational zone, and then I could not put a house on it. You're saying
you could build a campground with a caretaker residence.
or we also
I
could
can't build a house on my own.
Yeah, but this is what zoning is. It's setting up permitted uses.
Okay.
Better be careful how you vote, Sam.
And then you can also solve that. You can also solve that with a specific use permit, which becomes a non-conforming. You would basically just apply to say, I want to build my house back.
If I were king for the day in Martindale, I'd get rid of all specific use permits, because they're unless they're done for a specific reason, they cause a lot of administrative burden.
No pun intended.
Well, before we close, could you just define farm, ranch, or orchard? Because that was
Can we just get back on topic? Because I think, like, what I've heard, it's like, and Sam, it's no offense, but we've talked a lot about your property. If we could just get back on task and try to finish out and close out, and then on the next zoning ordinance or meeting, whatever we have, if we could have it beforehand to study it, so we could just, like.
I believe this was sent on Thursday.
Well, I mean, no, the other stuff, like, to be able to look at the map, I wasn't able to.
Oh yeah, the map.
All that.
Yeah.
And then so.
Hopefully I can get a scanner to work. So going back on task, what I wanted to get to, and then we can call it if we may, or we can make a motion at any time to adjourn.
Yeah, I'm ready.
You're the city council. Is to go through the campground ordinance or the regulations and describe and define whether these things are are items that we'd want to consider, these design standards, whether there's something we want to consider or not in campgrounds, and then how they would apply to recreational vehicle parks, RV parks.
That's too much of a discussion. I say
Yeah,
let's
that's
table
a
this
lot.
and continue the discussion for a little bit next meeting. I'm getting tired.
Somebody
So
said,
is that a motion?
I think, is this our last item?
Well,
So let's finish it if it's our last item.
Wait a minute.
There's plenty of, there is chock full of edits in here.
50 or 60 of y'all of these things, and we've got about 2 or 3.
This was the big one, and what I hope to achieve is discuss this one, because that's where it's going to have the most creative writing whenever I come back, and given some of the urgency of the planning and zoning considerations that are being made now regarding rezoning to a commercial district or not for land use in certain parts of our town. It'd be helpful for me to have direction on this, but we can push it off for another time.
No,
I
keep
think we've had a good discussion, but we're all getting a little tired. It's been here 3 hours, so after a full day's worth of activity. So I think we need to get to a point where we can wrap this up and then come back, pick it up again at some point in the future.
Yep.
So
I agree. I'll make a motion that we continue this discussion at a later time to finish discussing the campground RV changes.
at the next meeting.
I'd prefer it to be at the next meeting, because we have so many to go through. We need to do this a little bit on every meeting.
Agreed. I'll second your motion.
Mayor, I just have if I could ask a question.
sure.
So I'm just wondering, like, San Marcos has their planning and zoning people, like, there's a river committee, there's different committees. Like, why in city council do we not have a planning and zoning committee with people from the public to be able to come in and meet like 2 times a week or twice a month, in order to kind of expedite some of these things that are so pressing and that are so behind?
The answer to that question is, I don't know.
I don't know.
I mean, the ordinance allows for that, but we've never.
So Lisa, is that something you think that you would like to do, is like open it up to a committee with having the public coming in? And so that way you and Mike are able to have more meetings and workshops and, to kind of bring this stuff to an end? Because like our city council meeting, we've been talking about, in essence, planning and zoning things here for the last part. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to get done. Like, we could go through all of our city council meetings doing planning and zoning, because I feel like we're that far behind. So don't you believe like a committee would be beneficial for the city and having more meetings?
So planning and zoning, can call a meeting anytime it's necessary. And you're right, we are behind. However, if I understand correctly, the things that we're talking about that definitely are planning for the future and zoning in our city, those are council decisions. The Planning and Zoning Commission does not make decisions based on any of this information. It's an entity that fields the inquiries of the public.
But you also have community members that do have expertise in the area. Like on the river committee, you have people from the river. For planning and zoning, you would have people that, you would field out that have expertise in this area and have, a viewpoint from the public. You would field out people in that manner.
I get that, except for the fact that, the future planning for the city is designed to be set up for elected officials to make those decisions.
Yes, we would make the decisions, but the committee does the work.
Excuse me.
This is a separate item, I think. That needs to be on a city council agenda. If you want to start a new committee, it's not something we should be discussing now.
Excuse
Well,
me.
I think what Sonia is saying is we're sitting here talking about planning and zoning, the ordinance, but it's how it should be interpreted, et cetera. And is that the role of the planning and zoning people?
It's not.
And I kind of agree with Lisa that the ordinance belongs to the council, not
Right.
the planning and zoning commission, although they're the same set of people. So having a group of volunteers from the city to act as the planning and zoning commission, they wouldn't be rewriting this anyway. It really is the council that needs.
We would, I mean, like, how does San Marcos do it? How do other
They
communities
have
do it?
staff. They have hired
San
staff.
Marcos?
Yes.
They have hired staff.
Exactly, but I don't know, and Jan, I know that you're saying it should be, but do you not see how far behind we are? So do we need to start having more meetings?
And I will tell you, we are behind, and this is a drum I've been beating for a long time and not getting any merit. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Jared for bringing this online. You know, back when we were doing this, we had meetings at least 3 a month, and they were 3 and 4 hours long, and we dug like crazy on all this. And you know, it wasn't anywhere perfect, but we went from 1997 to, you know, 2010. And so here we are again. It's just the job at hand, and it needs to be on every single, at least one item, one ordinance, whether it be zoning. But another thing that I need to to remind everybody of, back then we also hired a firm that was ETR, which had, we hired a firm which was ETR. It was Thomas Rhodes and Ed Terrio, who were in business together with a company called ETR. And they were the ones who did all of the homework and brought all of the information like what Jared is doing to the council, explained to us what was legally permitted, what wasn't, for us then to make decisions on. That's how we got it done.
So
The motion still stands.
And I seconded it, the adjournment.
If you just want to have Jared complete this and then have a period for review and simply have the thing for an up and down vote without any discussion at council, unless it's based on written comments, you can do that.
I don't think that's the point. I think the discussion tonight has been very, you know, it's good to get everybody's point of view and that's what he needs to be able to go write these things. So the time, although it's a lot of time and there's a lot more to go through, is I believe beneficial for the city to go have that. Eventually, of course, you will come back and say, okay, this is what I think I heard, or here's the changes, et cetera. But I mean, when we pointed out that there was an awful lot of holes in the definitions and how to interpret this, you know, the zoning ordinances, the zoning ordinance, y'all said, let's go do it. So here we are doing it. So I think the suggestion earlier was, okay, we've run to the end of our brain power for tonight, giving him a lot of good input, and he's going to take that back, but there's more to go. So we'll just go schedule it up and tee it up at the next go round.
So
have another hour of this.
If we need
Rob,
down for a workshop on Saturday or on a Friday night or a Saturday night or whatever we need to do to have a workshop starting in the morning. If we have to have it throughout the afternoon, priorities, do it. Let's do a workshop rather than cramming it into our city council meeting.
All right, that's a good idea. Mike, what do you got?
I'm agreeing with you. It would be best for us to discuss the verbiage as we go through it with Jared. I agree with you on that one.
Everybody got a problem with doing this on a
We better do it soon.
Regular basis. No,
I have a ticking clock.
So yeah, I'm down for a workshop.
I don't have a problem with a workshop, and that's where we do all the stuff that we're talking about now. And then after the workshop, when we've given Jared, basically Jared is our hired firm this go round. He's the one doing the kind of work that we had done before.
Everybody good for a Saturday?
I am.
We will try to tee up a Saturday coming up. It won't be this coming one, but it'll be
Thank you.
sometime in there. All right. Now we have a motion to adjourn and with a second. Anybody else in favor?
I just want to add one thing to a future agenda item you have on there for the park to talk about phase one. I also want to add Guardiola Park to that because we're going to have a Parks Advisory Committee meeting before February 2nd. And so I would like to include improvements not only to phase one, but to Guardiola Park in the future discussion. And I would like to prioritize that as much as possible to get things moving.
All right.
Phase one's on there, right?
Yeah.
Add, instead of just having phase one and Guardiola Park,
Well, we can put all parks on there.
all parks.
But the reason phase one's on there saying that that's what you asked for last time.
Yeah, but, yeah,
So
I want to add all
that's
parks.
good. That's fine. Now, we have a motion and a second, and we have one other aye to adjourn.
Aye.
Pam
Aye, yes, thank you.
and Mike,
Aye.
we are adjourned.
All right.
Thank y'all very,
Thank y'all.
Everybody, I think we did a good job today.
thank you. Very, very, very nice to work with everyone tonight.
Bye-bye.
Night.
Aye.
Trying to get out of here.